So just by way of introduction, our speaker tonight, Bishop Paul Mason, was sort of born in North Shields.
Sort of born in North Shields. I actually was born in
Sort of born. And that raised all kinds of questions. Maybe another talk on that. I went to King's College London, worked in Italy with Olivetti, later moved to London to work for Hewlett Packard, and then was in formation for the diocesan priesthood at the Venerable English College in Rome. Started your priestly ministry in Purley, John the Baptist as assistant priest, and went into hospital chaplaincy, something which I understand is still very, very close to your heart. You're on the sort of National Healthcare Advisory Group currently. Bishop Paul was the sort of pastoral director at Allen Hall Seminary for a time, and at the same time worked as director for the ongoing formation of priests in this diocese. Celebrating your own anniversary pretty much. Second year of episcopal ordination just a handful of days ago. So an absolute delight to welcome you back. I know you worked here for a long period of time as ongoing formation of priest director. So please, a round of applause for tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much. Seeing these people from Purley in the back row over here, when I was newly ordained down to Purley, and I had to stand up and preach, I could almost hear my own knees knocking. So if you hear anything this evening, it's because you've got a lot of people from Purley in. Anyway, thank you very much, Mark, for your kind introduction. Importance of adult formation. It is important. It's very, very important. And what I'd like to do this evening is to look a little bit at the context in which we try to catechize, to evangelize, because understanding the context we're working in is very important, because if we don't understand it, then we'll just, it'll be a dialogue of the deaf with the culture. So we need to understand what is the context that we're teaching into. I'm going to look at it under three different headings. I'd like to look at it under, I think there's a generally held misunderstanding of what faith is. So I want to look at what that misunderstanding out there might be and how we adapt our catechesis to work with that. I want to look at the relationship between church teaching, doctrine, and praxis, because sometimes, it seems as though these become separate entities, what the church teaches and what we actually do. And then I'd just like to look finally, briefly, at what should we lead with when we provide catechesis? How should we lead our way into it? What is the best and most effective way to lead into good catechesis? So under those three headings, let's kick off. The first one, looking at a misunderstanding of faith. Has anyone read the 1998 encyclical Fides et Ratio? It's by my hero, John Paul II. Well, it would be in 1998. And he said a lot of things in that. Let me just distill a couple of things. He said, faith without reason, he argues, leads to superstition. Reason without faith leads to nihilism and relativism. Let me just look at those a little bit. The first one, faith without reason leads to superstition. It's remarkable, the propensity for human beings to believe in snake oil. I mean, it is absolutely remarkable. And I'm sorry if you're into homeopathy, but there's no science at all, but people will swear by it. And you wonder what on earth is going on, that we believe things without any sort of any belief behind it. There was a very interesting thing I was reading recently. Water boards finding leaks. They've been using divining rods to find water. Well, a professor of philosophy saw this happening at the end of her street, and she complained to the water board that this man with his divining sticks must have been paid out of local council tax, and there is no science behind this, and it's absolute rubbish. Why should we be paying for this when there's no science behind it? So I thought, oh, I'm one of these people. I thought, well, doesn't it work divining? I just thought it worked. I mean, I didn't question it. It works, doesn't it? I see heads nodding. It works, doesn't it? Well, you go to one scientific study after another. It doesn't work. The Smithsonian in America have offered $1 million to anybody who can prove it works. I mean, they put the money where their mouth is. And as one wag said as I was reading through this, the reason they think it works, because if you drill down deep enough anywhere, what do you find? Water. So it's quite remarkable of the things that can be held as belief, but in fact, it is just superstition. We think it works, but there's nothing to back it up. Then on the other hand, reason on its own, without any faith, leads to nihilism. Well, of course it would, because if all you're believing in is your own potential and capacity to reason, you've made the world a very, very small place inside your own head. So it leads to basically believing in nothing except what's inside your own head. And it leads to a relativism as well, because we can, with our reason, we can justify all sorts of things to ourselves. We can make a case for anything if we want to. So you can see how reason on its own, unbridled, can lead to a type of relativism. So are you okay so far with those two things? Yeah? How many people think at Catholics we believe in medieval, mumbo-jumbo, Catholic hocus-pocus? I mean, there's a lot of people who think that. And I suspect there are lots of people who sit in churches on Sunday who harbour a suspicion that it might be mumbo-jumbo. It's there within our culture that this is a medieval thing, it's non-scientific. How can you prove your faith to me? No proof. Irrational is the big one. I can't believe in that stuff that you believe. It's all irrational. I remember once getting a small glimpse into how people must see Catholics. And again, it was in Purley, actually, at Thomas More School. I used to say Mass on Thursday mornings in the school for about a handful of teachers. And there was a cleaner in the school who wasn't a believer. And he'd always used to pull my leg about all of this Catholic mumbo-jumbo stuff. And one morning at Mass, I was in this small room that we used. The door to the corridor was open, and I could hear him out there with his mop. And he got to the door mopping so he could see through to where we were, just as I was saying with a bit of bread, "This is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And for that moment, I saw what I was doing through his eyes, and I thought, I can see why people think what we do is extremely odd. So it is out there. And the reason I mention it now is because I think when we're teaching, even people in our parishes, this is the kind of the atmosphere we're all working in. We're all, perhaps through a process of osmosis, becoming victims of this type of thinking, these sorts of doubts. Let me read something here. Thomas called a twin, who was one of the 12, who was not with them when Jesus came. When the disciple said, "We have seen the Lord," he answered, "Unless I see the holes the nails made in his hands, and unless I can put my finger into the holes, and unless I can put my hand into his side, I refuse to believe." Right, so what is the message of that particular piece of scripture? It means, well, we've got to have faith, and asking questions, we shouldn't ask questions, you should just have faith, not questioning these things. Do you think that's the interpretation of that? Well, I think perhaps that's not the best interpretation. A friend of mine, Stan, he's Jewish. When he was being brought up, he used to be told if he ever asked a question about the Jewish faith and people didn't know the answer, he'd be chastised by his mum and she would say, "That's a holy question." In other words, don't even start asking it because it's a holy question. That is not how we work as Catholics. We love questions in the Catholic faith. That would be a misinterpretation of Thomas, to say that we shouldn't ask questions. At the Annunciation, the angel Gabriel says to Mary, "Behold, you are to conceive and bear a son." What does she say? Well, how can that be? She's asking a question straight away. How can that come about? I'm a virgin. She asks a question. She went and pondered these things in her heart. She went away scratching her head thinking, I wonder how this could be possible. She's asking questions. We don't have to sacrifice reason to believe. Quite the opposite. We need to employ the reason to believe. And I think if you do feel as though you have to sacrifice your mind, you're not dealing with authentic faith. So that would be the first thing in terms of how we approach things. St. Thomas Aquinas, apart from Sebastian at the back, who has read the Summa Theologia? Summa Theologia? You have read it, haven't you?
Some of it.
Some of it. Right. Not many people have read it. However, anybody who opens it up, you realise it is just question after question after question after question. And at the very start, you know what the question is? Is there a God? Now, if your religion can start off by saying, is there a God? That's a religion that really enjoys questions. It is not afraid to ask a question. It doesn't think it will incur God's wrath because it asked a question. All of the synoptics, they all say, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your mind. So it's quite clear, again, that we need to use our mind. The mind is God made. If it's God made, then somehow it's made to find its way back to where it came from. A bit like a salmon going back to where it was spawned. It goes back to where it came from. Or a bit like, I don't know, I always like the idea that the existence of hunger surely indicates the existence of food. I mean, the fact that we're hungry means that food must exist. The fact that our minds ask questions and want to know about what is the ultimate reality, what is God. The fact that our minds do that, to me, is an indication, but there must be something out there, there must be a God. So unlike the cry of the Protestant Reformation, sola fide, that's not the cry of the Catholic Church. The cry of the Catholic Church is fides et ratio, faith and reason. Start up at 10. What did St. Anselm say on this? Theology is?
Faith seeking understanding.
You're not supposed to answer, you run the place.
We're in trouble if you don't know.
Theology is faith seeking understanding. Again, not blind faith, not just kind of, let's take all of this because we've been told it and that's it, end of. Actually, a number of you look like you are, the cut of your jib, you're of a certain age. Let me ask you another couple of questions. Who made you?
God made me.
God made me. Right, catechism. First question, isn't it? Catechism. Second question. Why did God make you? To know Him, to love Him, to serve Him in this world, and to be happy with Him forever in the next. I love the order of that second one. Why did He make you? Why did He make you? To know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him. You can't love what you don't know. And you won't serve what you don't love. So, starting with knowing is very, very important. So don't suppress reason to have faith. So, my first approach, if you like, for the teaching of the faith is don't be afraid of reason and thinking. It doesn't mean that you've become a textbook type of person. It just means we've been given a mind by God, and that mind has been made to seek God. That natural light of our reason, even if you're a non-believer, the natural light of our reason, because it's made by God, should take us back to Him as we use it to try and discover Him. You'll hear from a number of the new atheists that faith is what they'd call infra-rational. It's beneath reason. Reason simply doesn't come into play when it comes to faith. And as I said earlier, if that is the case, then we're dealing with superstition. If faith is infra-rational, doesn't need reason, we end up with naivety, credulity, Santa Claus, Loch Ness Monster. That's the stuff of believing something without reason. You end up believing in just about anything. But it is on the far side of reason. It's not that it's irrational, but they would call it supra-rational. So we surrender ourselves to something that enchants us from the other side of reason. A bit like, I don't know, the sun going down over the hill in antiquity. People must have wondered, where is it going every day? It goes down over there. I don't understand it. So, well, I don't understand it, but I'm going to go and find out. You don't wait to understand it before you go and have a look or decide you've figured it out. Without knowing, you go because you're enchanted from beyond the horizon. Let me show you a book. I came across this years ago, and I really like them. I don't know if you've come across them. You ever come across 3D art? I mean, they're really good, and I've used this with kids before. And it's how they work is this. So you've got kind of a computer-generated image on there. There's loads of them. And you look at it, and there's nothing on there except chaos. If you look at it, I mean, that could be the world as we're in it. I mean, it can just look like that. So you try. It tells you on the front, you read it, you say, you look at it, and a three-dimensional image will come out of it. When you look at that all day, you think there's nothing coming out of that. Then it tells you how you do it, and this is very interesting. Where you make the mistake is we stare at the page trying to see the image. What it tells you to do is to stare at an imaginary point about here. So this goes out of focus. So you have to relax your eyes. It takes you a while to get used to. And if you focus on this imaginary point here, a 3D image comes out, and you move the page around, and you can see it moves in 3 dimensions. It's really quite remarkable. I'll let you have a look at it a bit later. Now, I mean, I think this is it's a wonderful thing in terms of this approach to the faith, because could I, just by going through each pixel of this, discern some irregularity that would give me the outline of a shape? I probably could. It would take me forever. So that's like using my unenlightened philosophical mind, theological mind, just to figure out with my brain what's on the page. And I would probably figure out that there was a shape there that didn't quite fit in with the rest of it. It would take a bit of work, but it could be done. But what I wouldn't see is the image coming out in 3 dimensions. I only get that if I focus on the point behind here. And when you do that, as I say, it comes out in 3 dimensions. Now, this is very much how we have to, I think, understand the faith with regard to reason. It's not that it's irrational, it's we're looking beyond reason, and when we look beyond reason, the things in the here and now start to make sense. But it takes a leap of faith, if you like, to be enchanted enough to think, I really want to know what's beyond, to help me understand what's in the here and now. So that would be one example. The stuff, they've got these computers now, I mean, to figure out who you should be matched up with, they're really quite sophisticated, very sophisticated algorithms. And so they're asking 1,000 questions. I think it's almost literally 1,000 questions to figure out who you are. They give you all of this stuff, and they try to match you with your ideal partner. Until you actually go on a date and meet the person, you're not going to know, because it's another person. They will speak, they will reveal something about themselves. You'll decide whether you like them, you'll decide whether you believe them. And then at that point, you kind of take a step of faith. We call it falling in love, don't we? Because we're not in control. Now, can you imagine if you would only ever have a relationship with somebody where beforehand you figured out exactly what they are in every detail, sorted, right, I'll go out with that person. Will you ever get to know that person? I mean, you would never get to know that person. It would be absolutely bonkers. Lots of people want that sort of control, and they want that sort of control in another relationship with another person. They want that type of control in their relationship with God. We can learn a heck of a lot through the algorithms of philosophy and theology. We can learn so much, it'll get us so far. But then we're drawn into something more, because ultimately the mystery is beyond reason, not irrational, it's just beyond reason. And we're called to make a step of faith, because we're enchanted by that place, that's something else. We're drawn into it. Because God is a person, we are drawn into the mystery of a relationship. We've got to wait for him to speak. Not all on our terms, not all our calculations and figuring out, we wait for him to speak. Do I trust? Do I believe? And then we move forward. God has revealed so much to us that we couldn't have deduced. Our own faculty of thought will get us so far, but can you imagine if 10 years before Christ was born, you got the brightest scholars in the world to say, right, God's going to come in 10 years' time, can you figure out how he's going to do it? How many would say he'd be born as a child and die on a cross? I mean, who could ever have come to that conclusion? We had to meet the person to have that revealed to us. And again, that wasn't an irrational thing that happened, the incarnation and the cross. They were just things that were beyond human reason to conceive of such things. So the only way we ultimately relate to any other person is through faith. If you only use your reason, you'll not really ever get to know a person fully. How much, therefore, could you ever get to love them? Because you can't love what you don't know. So it takes us back to that. We know them very little, and we wouldn't know how to love them. It's all about control freakery, perhaps fear, I don't know. But I don't know if any of you still have parents, or when your parents were alive, if you were to ask your dad, you know, what was it that made him marry your mum? I mean, do you think he'd say, well, you know, after carrying out due diligence and looking at some key performance indicators, you just wouldn't do it that way, not at all. It's wonderful. We let go, don't we? We allow ourselves to be drawn into a mystery. And God invites us into that mystery of faith. It's the same in all relationships. Today we've got, well, they're not all still alive, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Stephen Fry, Stephen Hawking. A very aggressive rationalism. Very aggressive rationalism. What is rationalism? I've got nothing against using the rational mind. God, I wish you would need to use the rational mind. And look what it's given us. It's given us so much. The trouble is when you reduce all types of knowledge to the scientific form of knowledge. If you say, the only thing I will say, I believe it and I know, is something that can be proven to me scientifically, that is very, very narrow. Because as I say, how do you ever know another person if you apply a scientific model of trying to understand them? We know very, very little. So going back to Thomas the Apostle, it's okay to question. It's very good to question. But he goes too far. Unless I do this, unless I do that, unless I do the other, I won't believe. And that's when it can become an aggressive type of rationalism. Unless you can prove to me categorically in these scientific terms, then I refuse to believe. I think that is just the current thing that we're operating in at the moment. And even people in churches, they're at work every day. They're submersed in this sort of thinking in the world. So when we approach catechesis, I think to revisit the Catholic approach of ratio in relation to our faith, it's very, very important. Actually, a little postscript on Thomas, which I think has a big impact on catechesis. Thomas wasn't with the others when the Lord appeared, it says. Tried to figure it out himself, doing his own thing, he wasn't there. When he came back to the group and he was with the others, that's when he saw him. How many people, I've seen this through Catholic Alpha many times, where there are people who, you know, perhaps they're on the margins of the faith, they're a bit interested in the faith, perhaps they've been going to Mass for 20 years but never really kind of fully come alive with it. They join an Alpha group. They're in a group of other people searching for faith, asking questions. How much more we can see when we're not just left to our own devices, but we come together with other like-minded people in a spirit of faith and wanting to learn. It's remarkable how those groups can reveal to themselves, through their conversation, through their questions, through their shared experience, that they can come to an understanding of God. So I think that is a a very, very important part of any catechesis. But I know that's how it's done anyway in parishes. Right, that was the first part. I'll have to get my skates on. How long have I got?
As long as you wish.
I'm not going to live tonight, won't they?
Within reason.
Within reason, okay. This is a bit of a hobby horse of mine at the moment. On the teaching of morals. It's very important to the teaching of the Catholic Church. And church teaching, that's doctrine, and the moral teaching and the ethics of the church. I keep coming across lots of surveys, I haven't got any I can quote, but I keep hearing of them, I suspect they're true, where about half of practicing Catholics do not believe in the real presence of our Lord in the Eucharist. On a whole host of moral questions within the church, I'll not ask for a show of hands, but how many people think, oh, just the church going off on one, you know, and do not hold to the teaching of the Catholic Church in so many areas of the moral life. Have you ever heard this before? It's not really important what you believe. What matters is that you're a good person. Have you ever heard that? I mean, I hear it quite a lot. Oh, it doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you're a good person. Oh, but before I go any further, who agrees with that? Oh, thank God for that. Oh, there's almost a hand went up there. Okay, let me give a point of view that you might want to ask a question about later. Parting the ways between doctrine and praxis, where ethics trumps doctrine. I'll not go into a whole philosophy of it, but you'll know the basics of philosophy, how with Descartes wanting to, I mean, not a bad man, he had an intellectual exercise that he wanted to carry out. You know, what is it that I can't doubt? And he figured out the only thing I can't doubt is that I think. Starting at that point, oh, well, the only thing I can't doubt is my own capacity for thinking. What happened? We shifted a very important debate. A debate moved from what is true, because theological debate was always, well, what is true? It moved from what is true to what can I be certain of? That's quite a different philosophical question to ask. What is true? What can I be certain of? Can you see the shift from true out there to what can I be certain of in here? This kind of anthropological, this shift towards the person. 100 years later, this is picked up by Immanuel Kant. Kant said, religion boils down to ethics, which is the same as I said before, it doesn't matter what you believe, it's as long as you're a good person. So Kant was saying this, religion boils down to ethics. So all religious practices are fine in as much as they contribute to good behaviour. Sounds compelling as far as it goes so far. There's a lot more to be said on that, and I did quite a lot of Kant when I was in Rome, and so I could talk a bit about synthetic a priori propositions, but I think you'd all fall asleep and I would as well. Let's just leave it at that, that Kant says religion boils down to ethics. So he's driven a wedge between doctrine and ethics. I think that's a dangerous place to be, and let me talk a bit about that. Are you a good person? That's a question we might want to ask ourselves. There are many different private spiritualities, if it doesn't matter what you believe, and if you don't have some sort of doctrine or fundamental thing that you believe, then you will end up believing all sorts of things. It's a bit like a crossword without clues. You know, 3 across, Reiki, 5 down, New Age. You fill in anything you like because there's nothing out there telling you otherwise. It's just down to what you decide your personal spirituality is. Your personal spirituality becomes a private matter. Irrelevant, are you a good person? Tell me that first and foremost. The reason I think it's dangerous is because fundamental ethics are grounded in doctrine. If we reject the doctrine, if we pay lip service to the doctrine, we undermine the ethical directive which gives us the guidance. Let me give another image. If your journey through life is an OS map, and you're looking at the OS map, and there are many turns, many bifurcations, many routes you can take. You've got your map, there it is, and you've got a compass. So that's, if you like, your mind. Great. But magnetic north has been removed from the planet. Now, what could you do? Well, if that were the case, you'd think, well, one guy says, well, my needle is pointing that way, so that's the right way. The other person says, oh, well, my needle's pointing that way, therefore that's the right way. In the absence of magnetic north, whichever arbitrary way your needle of your compass happens to be pointing becomes, by default, the right way. And this can be a real problem, because if we don't have that fundamental thing we believe, the doctrine giving the direction, then ultimately it will degenerate into, well, I think it's this, you think it's that, fine. It becomes very relative. As John Paul said with Fides et Ratio, it degenerates into a terrible sort of relativism. Who says what constitutes the good? We bandy that around. All that matters is that you're a good person. Then you say, well, what does it mean to be a good person? What does that consist of? Okay, a good person is a loving person. I agree with that, I think. What is love? Would then be the next question. Can I throw that out as another starter for 10? What is love? A definition of love?
Isn't it who is love?
What is it? Well, I'm asking, what is love?
Willing the good for someone.
Willing the good. Willing the good for somebody. I mean, that's a wonderful answer, I think, to that question. It's, what is love? It's willing the good of the other for their sake. It's pure altruism. Nothing to do with you. Whether we're, to the extent we're capable of it, well, I don't know. To ultimately give of oneself is what we all try to do. That is, I think, an excellent definition of love. Not a feeling, and it's also not what can, nowadays, be understood as good, where, well, you don't do any harm to me, and I won't do any harm to you. I mean, social contract theorists, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan, you read these people, and they'll talk about the basis of the moral life. And of course, they say, well, fundamentally it was this kind of contracting between each other. You don't do that to me, I'll not do it to you. And it becomes a contract, an unwritten contract, but it's really just a kind of self-enlightened, self-interested way of trying to live out your life. And in ethics, you would simply, I mean, it's known as contractualism. Whether you could call it good or loving, I'm not so sure that you could, because there's clearly a self-interest there. So love is breaking free from the self, altruistic. It's a theological virtue, faith, hope, and love. So we have a theological virtue. It's a sharing in God's way of being. The fact that we're capable at all of being able to give of ourselves for another person is because we share in something of God's love. The animals can't do that. We can do it, and we can do it because we're made in God's image. Therefore, we can share in something of His nature. He can do it, therefore we can. Now, if you get rid of God or doctrines about God, my argument would be that type of love, that really selfless love, would diminish. Think of the theological truths that depend on this. Everyone is worthy of respect, we would say. We might take that for granted, but it's not self-evident. We're all subjects of rights and dignity. We say ultimately that we are the subjects of rights and of dignity because we're made in God's image. Now take God out of it, any doctrine of what God is, and our doctrine of God is that He gives Himself, He gave Himself on the cross. That's our image of God. Take God away. Think of the ancient Greeks. Slavery all over the place. Where were the rights and dignity there of the human person? Who had rights? A handful. Aristocrats had rights. Malformed children were left to die. Soviet Russia, Stalin's Russia, to achieve particular ends, millions killed. Hitler, Germany, millions killed to achieve a particular end. Do you think there might be a link between people not believing in God and these two latter ones, Stalin and Hitler, not believing in God, and somehow we end up with this mass slaughter. I would suggest that moving away from the doctrine and the fundamental teaching, because it's quite specific about this self-giving nature of what love is, we move away from that teaching and understanding, then the whole thing can start to fall about our ears, and love can disappear. The most recent one, what just happened in Ireland, 66% of those who voted. I mean, so many people have just given up the faith in Ireland. Perhaps some of them might say they've got good reason. That's another discussion. But we've just had a vote where 66% of the people have voted to kill unborn children. And you think, if you ask them, do you think you're a good person? I bet you to a person they say, I think I'm a good person. Is there a link between doctrine and ethics? I mean, there has to be a link between doctrine and ethics. You take doctrine out, you take God out, and ethics can become whatever you want it to be. What is good will become whatever you decide is good. And I think it's quite a dangerous thing, a dangerous place to be. And we do hear this now and again where, you know, those who hold the teachings of the church, oh, that's just what the church teaches, that's just, you know, that's just rules. But I'm a pastoral person, and therefore it's okay what you're doing. And you know, that's very, very dangerous pastorally. When you start to drive that wedge between what the church teaches and then what you say as pastoral, as though the two were separate. They're not, and they can't be. And in any fundamental catechesis, anything that smacks of, oh, well, yes, the church says that, but really, alarm bells need to ring for you. Clearly, the pastoral approach of how we introduce and work with the teaching of the church, it's not just to be wagging fingers and pointing at people. It has to be done very sensitively. But to go so far as to say, oh, that's just being rule-minded, and being pastoral is actually, well, actually what I've discovered that what a lot of people mean by being pastoral is giving people what they want. And giving people what they want is not being pastoral. Being pastoral is giving people what they need. So that's the second part. I'll have to do the last part quite quickly. For the last one, a quick look at theological transcendentals. The good, the bad, and the ugly. Oh, sorry, no, it's not. It's the true, the good, and the beautiful. The true, the good, and the beautiful. You'll have, I mean, I'll have seen this. It gets commented on quite a lot. It's a bit of a cliche, but it's one of those things that it's good to recount because there's truth in it. You know, you see kids at school, you know, they'll be studying Shakespeare, they'll be doing quadratic equations in maths, they'll be looking at, you know, complex reasons for the start of the First World War. And then you look at their RE book and it's a comic book. You know, you look at it and it's just, it's shallow. It's got no depth to it. We've got a depth of an intellectual tradition in the Catholic Church. And it's almost as though we're afraid of it. That we think, oh, well, no, let's put that to one side. And when you see some of the stuff that is done for catechesis, is what do you feel about this? What do you feel about? Well, of course, I agree it's important that you ask people what they feel and think about something, but not in a vacuum. You need to give them something first. You need to give them some content of the faith. And we have this beautiful, long tradition of intellectual tradition, and though pre-Christian, it's, you know, it's Greek roots. And I'm not saying we've all got to be scholars, but something of a basic understanding of the intellectual tradition that we have, it's really, really important. You see young people who turn away from the faith, and they've been reading Dawkins or Stephen Hawking, they've been reading this. What have they been reading that's turned them away? They've been reading a philosophical argument, and they've read it and they've thought, oh, well, the comic books I've been reading on religion in school don't anywhere near meet this stuff. They just don't. And so we need to find some way to, as I say, to get that back into the teaching of our faith. And it's difficult because for most Catholics, when does your formal Catholic education stop? It's when you're confirmed. So 15, 16, that's when you stop studying any theology. And then we're asking catechists to delve into the intellectual tradition of the Catholic Church. I mean, how do you expect the poor folk to do that? They've got jobs and other things to do. So trying to reclaim it. I mean, I've not got any answers other than to say that we need to reclaim our intellectual tradition. I put a word of caution on, though. If we focus too much on doctrine, even, it's true, we can just turn the faith into something kind of an intellectual debating society. Was it Lord Soper who used to stand at Hyde Park Corner, and he made the claim that he never lost an argument. And once he said in a radio interview, shortly before he died, "It's true that I used to say that I never lost an argument." He paused and said, "But did I ever win a soul?" And I thought that was a very good thing for him to say. So just a reminder that while I bang on about the intellectual tradition, not just treat the faith as an academic exercise, of course not. So lead, yes, important to lead and have the importance of the intellectual side, but not to the point that it turns into a debating society. Leading with moral teaching. We've got to be careful if we lead our catechesis with moral questions, because that can start to look like, oh, it's the church giving it this again, telling us how wrong and naughty we all are. It's a kind of Puritanism. Who are you to tell me what to do? This is what we're going to get. And you can end up with single-issue Catholics, where the only thing that they think about in their faith is the one issue that they're pursuing. Now, as laudable as that one issue might be, it's not very attractive to the faith when all you get is just one issue all of the time. You often come across many people who might be against the moral teaching of the church, even some clergy. You say, actually, could you explain to me then exactly what the teaching of the church is on that? So often you don't get much articulated back in terms of a clear understanding of what it is the church actually does say on it. It just becomes this general ideal of just what the church says. But you say, well, could you amplify that and give me some understanding of what the church really teaches on this subject? It's surprising how often you don't really get an answer to that question. So dismissing something of one's faith without even understanding it in the first place. And also to do in the spirit that the teachings of the church, I know they can seem like it's just binding us up, it's just making life difficult. It's not. Those teachings liberate us, because there is a wisdom in there. And just because we don't see it in our own tiny minds doesn't mean it's not right. We've got to let go, we've got to trust again, that it's not just a bunch of crusty old men in Rome deciding how can we make life difficult for the people of God around the world. Oh, I've got a good one here, this will really wind them up. No, not at all. Those teachings are there to liberate us and to teach the moral teaching of the church in that spirit, that these things are there to liberate you. It's a wonderful way to go about teaching the faith. And then one finally on the beautiful. I was very glad to see that in this course of talks there's something on Raphael, there's something on the Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, and there's something on art and faith. We've got such beautiful art. Not only have we got a great intellectual tradition in our faith, we've got the most beautiful stuff as well, better than everybody. I'm biased, of course. But the beauty of what we've got in the Catholic Church. When, I'm sure we've all got our pet hates about where this beauty has been lost. I put a couple of my pet hates down, I shouldn't really record this. A lot of my Catholicism came from the 1970s. It seemed we went from sacred Baroque to the birdie song in no time at all. Do you know, it's some of the music, and dear God in heaven, and we wonder why people don't go. It's got a lot better latterly. I think we've made a lot of strides, but certainly in the 70s and 80s, some of the stuff bind us together, Lord, with cords that cannot be broken. I mean, this sort of thing. Sorry, I'm perhaps saying too much. Anyway, that's one pet hate. Another one. Nylon vestments. Anyway. But I'm not going to say too much. Then I was at Mass somewhere a year ago, and it was in the northeast. I'd gone up to see my folks, and I sat in church. I didn't concelebrate, and it was round about Christmas time, and a an extraordinary minister of the Eucharist, he was up there on the sanctuary. He had a brown T-shirt on. Well, first of all, he looked like he hadn't had a haircut in a year, but anyway, that's beside the point. He had a brown T-shirt on with Rudolph the reindeer with flashing lights. And the lights were flashing. He was distributing Holy Communion this way. And again, I thought, and we wonder why people don't want to come to our church for the beauty. When you walk into a church, you should be utterly seduced by the beauty of that church. Unfortunately, we've lost a lot of our beautiful churches, for reasons you all know. And a lot of our churches now, as functional as they are that. They're functional. They're places to gather. Yet you go into an old Baroque church. It's just screaming the story of salvation. The Stations of the Cross, the stained glass windows. It's everywhere. It's screaming at you. You can smell it. The incense from 500 years is stuck to the walls. All of this draws you towards Almighty God. Art, the beautiful art that we've got for teaching. You know, I'm not a soppy person, but I lived in Rome for 6 years, and I would say at least 3 times a week for 6 years, I would walk into St. Peter's to say a prayer. And I would always stop at the Pietà. And at every single time, I'm having to stop a tear coming when I look at the beauty of that piece of art. And I think the Sistine Chapel does the same. So the art, the architecture of the place, you just walk in and you feel as if in some churches you're walking into God's home. The liturgy, I'm not going to get started too much on the liturgy because that would be, we could have all sorts of fights, but do you know, it's that the central thing we do, it's the most important thing we do. How often, you know, a reader will come up with a piece of paper and they haven't prepared it and you can hardly hear them. The priest coming out carrying half a dozen books and, you know, you think he's just got out of bed. I'm not saying it happens a lot, it can happen, and I've seen it. And the whole sense of the transcendent nature of the mystery, it can be lost. And again, we think, oh, you're just fussing about things. It's not liturgical fussiness. Beauty is not liturgical fussiness. Pope Francis is right. If you are becoming fussy, and all you're interested in is how much lace you've got on the bottom of your alb, we've got a problem. And he's quite right to identify that stuff. But when it comes to beauty, then return to beauty and embrace that beauty and use it to teach. There's a friend of mine, who's the rector at Allen Hall. He tells me that when he became a Catholic, he walked into the back of a church, he just saw a church door of a Catholic church, and he went in, and they had exposition of the Blessed Sacrament. He was so beguiled by this, and the beauty and the wonder of it all. It wasn't an argument in his case, it was the beauty that drew him into the church. So, there's my 3 things on catechesis. Understanding of the faith, get that right. Beware of separating ethics from doctrine, and looking at how we can use each of these things, whether it's the intellect, be careful how we use that, don't go too far. With the moral lead, don't lead too much on the morals, otherwise it sounds like this. But with the beauty, perhaps that's the best way, in fact. Start with the beauty. It's the least sort of challenging to people. And we all know when something is beautiful, it's beautiful. So there's my thoughts. Thank you very much.